CEEY, a leading think tank in Mexico, is hosting the Social Mobility Summit 2016. Some of the world's main experts will come together to discuss and help establish a broad agenda for research and policy making. Follow us via live streaming at socialmobilitysummit.org.
It is a great pleasure for me to introduce Richard Reeves, the last keynote we have. Richard is a senior fellow in economic studies, policy director of the Center on Children and Families, and editor-in-chief of the Social Mobility Memos blog at the Brookings Institution. He worked as director of strategy to the UK's Deputy Prime Minister. His previous roles include director of Demos, the London-based political think tank, director of Futures at the Work Foundation, principal policy advisor to the Minister for Social Reform, for Welfare Reforms, research fellow at the Institute for Public Policy Research, and researcher at the Institute of Psychiatry at the University of London. He is also a former European Business Speaker of the Year. He earned his BA from Oxford University and his PhD from Warwick University. With co-author Isabel Sohil, he was recipient of the Best Policy Paper in 2014, ranking in the University of Pennsylvania's annual Think Tank Award. With any further ado, please welcome Richard Reeves.
Thank you so much for that welcome, Julio, and to CEEY for inviting me and for organizing this conference, and indeed congratulations to the institution and to the supporters of the institution for putting social mobility on the agenda in Mexico. I saw almost immediately when the institute was formed, I had the chance to write about some of your work at Brookings and was genuinely delighted that there was another institution, another group of people who are pushing the agenda of social mobility. So I'm thrilled to be here. Julio mentioned that I'm British by background and worked in British politics and British journalism. I am now living in the US, and as of 2 weeks ago, I am a US citizen. So I did, thank you. Well, I wonder how long people will keep applauding. So the good news is that meant I was able to vote in the Brexit referendum and in the US general election. So I'm feeling pretty good right now about democracy. So just thank God I'm not Mexican or applying to come to Mexico. But I also like the timing of this conference is spectacularly good. And it can only be intentional that this conference precedes the last major music festival of the year, at least in the Americas. So tomorrow and Sunday, it's the Corona Music Festival. I see some of you know that and some of you don't. So fantastic timing. And just this is the lineup for tomorrow. So I just draw your attention to, I mean, some of these are obvious, but Killers, one of the most interesting British bands around at the moment, much covered, very, very good. Pet Shop Boys, in my view, have gone off the rails. I don't know what everyone else thinks, but I mean, they're new stuff, and they refuse to play some of their old stuff, which is just annoying. So who else would I pick out? I'd probably pick out Cloves is an incredibly good Australian singer-songwriter. She's sort of coming up. Courtney Barnett is obviously good. And if you're into sort of heavier rock, Young Fathers, I would thoroughly recommend to you as well. That's just, I haven't got time to do the next day's lineup as well, but this is a pretty good lineup, so thank you very much for the timing. And I might just leave it there, to be honest. That's probably the best you're going to get out of me. I've been changing my presentation until the last minute in response to the presentations that I've had. One of the problems with coming last is that either people say the things you were going to say, or they say things you want to disagree with, or to respond to. So I'm going to try and be as disciplined as possible with my time and talk about something like this. This is a painting by Georgia O'Keeffe. Georgia O'Keeffe, the American painter, was asked once in an interview how to make good art, what's the role of the artist? And she said the artist has to do three things. The job of the artist is to select, simplify, and amplify. And I'm going to argue, as I go through my presentation on the need for a policy architecture for mobility, that it's the job of policymakers and those close to them to select a particular goal, what is it we're trying to do here, to simplify that goal, and the indicators that will tell us if we are succeeding in a way that is amenable to policymakers, and then to amplify it through public declarations and institutional commitments. Select, simplify, amplify. That's what I mean by policy architecture, and that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to make the case for policy architecture, then I'm going to do a couple of case studies. I'm going to use the UK, where I worked in the coalition government, as a case study. I'm going to talk about a model that Isabel Sawhill created at Brookings called the social genome model, which is another case study, and then make my own proposals for discussion about how we might select, simplify, and amplify and create a policy architecture. So first of all, the case. This is the world as I wish it was. This is the world that Brookings scholars and academics dream about. This is a world in which you set a clear goal, social mobility, you have clear indicators of success, you have success measures, and then you have initiatives, programs, or policies that help you to achieve it. The success measures you can see in the middle will be long-term. Intergenerational mobility is a long-term goal, but also short-term. You'll see some shorter-term indicators of success. All of that's underpinned by data. Could not agree more with David Gruski about data and the facts. Data is also required for the evaluation of the initiatives. But critically, the evaluation of the initiatives takes place against the knowledge of which indicators you're trying to move. So what you have, hopefully, is evidence-based policymaking. That's what the EBPM, I don't know whether that phrase has taken root in Mexico as it has in the US and the UK, but it's the big thing, evidence-based policymaking. But you need to know what evidence you're looking for. You can't just go to a program and find out what evidence they've got and say, well, people like it, and that's evidence that it's working. So your indicators give you that list. This is the world as I wish it were. This is the world as I suspect it really is. Lots of rhetoric about social mobility or opportunity, certainly in the UK, there's lots of rhetoric about it, maybe a few indicators tucked away in the middle. Lots of discussion over big initiatives, so universal pre-K or free college or whatever. People love to talk about that stuff. Look at the bottom there, you'll see data in very small font. And the same with the indicators. How will we know if we're getting any of these wonderful things? And then evaluation over here. And what we get instead of evidence-based policy making is the evil twin, policy-based evidence making. We have these policies, find me some evidence they're working. We've spent billions on this. Find me evidence that it's working. It's the wrong way around because we're not clear enough at the outset of what success will look like. Between the rhetoric of opportunity on social mobility and the research that's done by many of the people in this room and others on the left, and then the policy, whatever that policy will be, there is a gap. There's a gap between those two. I argue that that gap has to be filled by what I call a policy architecture, not by policy itself. It's too quick to go from complex research papers, such as we've heard from here, to a discussion of whether we need vocational training or pre-K. First of all, we need to be clearer, hold on, what are we actually trying to do? How will we know if we're successful, and what are our indicators? That's what I mean by the architecture. And I think it has three components. A clear long-range goal, some shorter-term leading indicators, I use that in quotes so as not to be confused with the economic definition, and then institutions, both inside and outside government, that monitor progress and commit policymakers to the long term. These are what I think are the three components of a successful policy architecture. I'm going to say a bit about each. What's the goal? Well, the last 2 days, we've got into some of this. Social mobility, social fluidity, equality of opportunity, both, all three. Intergenerational, intragenerational, absolute, relative. And I'll come on to the discussion of the currencies we might use in a moment. But being clear as possible, what success would look like. How will we know if in 20 years' time there is more social mobility in Mexico? How will we know in 20 years' time if America has become more of an opportunity society? And if we don't know how we'll know, we haven't really said anything yet. So let's be clear about the goal. We can argue about the goal, and we will argue about the goal, but let's try and get as close as possible to it. So the absolute relative distinction is very important to me. I'm going to focus all my attention on relative mobility, because I think normatively that's more important. But I'll just repeat something I said in the conversation yesterday about the difference in how absolute and relative mobility are both important. It's easier, I think, to stomach downward relative mobility if there's lots of absolute mobility. It may also be the case that if there's not much relative mobility, you don't mind so much if everyone's getting better off. So I used this analogy from Steve Pearlstein yesterday, that if everyone's cruising along nicely, you don't mind if someone overtakes you. So you drop a quintile, your kids drop a quintile, maybe 2 quintiles. You know what? If your economy is growing at 4% a year, as it did for 25 years in the US, what's the big deal, right? If, on the other hand, there's less growth, if we're in for a period of sustained less growth, there's less absolute mobility, then relative mobility becomes both harder and more important to a sense of felt fairness. What's the currency? I won't spend much time on this, we spent so much time on it. Income, earning, status, box, class, etc. But we need to be clear about this as policymakers or those advising policymakers. We have to start making some calls. We have to start placing some bets. And I was trying to get through this without any data at all, but I couldn't resist. I won't spend any time on it. Most of you know these kinds of things. This is PSID, quintile transition matrix. Most of you know it, sticky at the top, sticky at the bottom, etc. So you can do income, and I like relative income mobility. I like that. I prefer Bash's approach, using rank directional mobility to these transition matrices. But nonetheless, these actually tell a quick story once you understand how they work. Maybe you should do education, which I did using PSID data as well. So you rank people's educational status and put them into quintiles. So maybe I care more about the inheritance of education. And here you see more stickiness at the top, actually, by comparison to income, a bit more. But broadly similar sorts of pictures. I could produce them. You could produce them for any number of things. Wealth, health, well-being, etc. All right. So we have to make some decisions. It's all very complex. So here are 2 quotes from November the 18th today. The idea that we can measure the inequality of opportunity is a dream. And as Chico said, mobility means different things to different people. So we are getting more, as every paper was presented, got more and more and more complicated, more complex, more nuances, more distinctions. Absolutely right. But if you wanted to influence policymakers, we have to go much further than that. We have to go through the complexity. And of course it's a dream that we can measure the inequality of opportunity. I completely agree. But I would say that's true of many of the things that we aspire to. So the question then becomes, how close can we get, and can we get close enough to help policymakers? So we have to simplify, but in the right way. This is a quote from the jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes. It speaks for itself. The way I interpret this is to say, you might start off with a simplistic view of the world. We need more opportunity by creating jobs, sort of. And then it gets more and more complicated, and the more academics you talk to, the more papers you read, the more complicated it gets, the more complex it appears to become, the more intractable it might appear to become. But you don't stop there, you keep going, and you get to the simplicity on the other side of complexity. So you say, yes, it's very complicated, but given everything we know, I think we should try and do this. And these are what I think are the best indicators of that. It's good enough for policy making. That's what we're seeking. Not perfect answers, but good enough answers to guide policy. Who decides? We're going to simplify. So what have we got here with social mobility opportunity? It's a broadly shared goal, but as I've said, and you said, very complex. There are strong normative elements here. And I'm delighted by how much discussion there's been of some of the normative concerns. These are not easy things to agree. People will disagree about this stuff forever. There are empirical challenges understanding what's going on. And there are potentially significant resource implications. If we're serious about this, and we want policymakers to react, they're going to start spending money differently. They're going to start spending time differently. This stuff matters. So this is quite correctly a political issue. This is not going to be decided by academics or think tanks. It's got to be decided by democratically elected officials if it's to be real. The question is, how do we support them in doing that through the policy architecture? So one thing you could do is ask people. Ask the public. Be direct democracy. And in a really, really nice study, some psychologists asked Americans what they thought the ideal rates of upward mobility would be. This is from the bottom quintile. So people are born into the bottom 20%. Where do you think they should end up by quintile? And then on the right is the real data from Pew, based on the same PSID work that I mentioned earlier, right? So that's how much stickiness there actually is. The numbers vary depending on how you do the calculation, but it'll do for our purposes. Look, And they split into liberals and conservatives. Everybody thinks that you should be massively upwardly mobile. They basically think, if you ask them the question this way, that whether you're born at the bottom should have almost no effect on where you end up. This is a social mobility utopia that people want. So we could just say, great, let's try for that. The snag, of course, as I won't spend too much time mentioning, you do then need some downward mobility. In fact, if this many people are going up to the top, then who's creating the room? So the researchers asked the other question too. What do you think is the ideal rate of downward mobility from the top quintile? Slightly different answer. Mathematically, in fact, they didn't ask about the middle quintiles. Mathematically, what that means is the people in the middle 3 quintiles need to have a worse chance of getting into the top quintile if you're going to get that and that. So this tells us that people aren't necessarily very good at making zero-sum trade-offs around relative intergenerational mobility. Fine. Nobody likes downward mobility except me. Get the point. But if you're a policymaker, useful to see what people are interested in. Everyone likes upward. I'm going to argue very strongly that we can use outcomes. I completely agree with the discussion about Roma and all the work's been done by egalitarian, responsibility-sensitive philosophers, Dworkin, etc. I love that work, but in the end, I think outcomes will do, at least for now, as a proxy of equality of opportunity. I think if you see pictures like the ones we've seen over the last 2 days, those gaps in mobility rates, those gaps in educational attainment by class, they simply cannot be explained away by factors other than genuine inequality of opportunity. So for now, both on pragmatic and normative grounds, I'll argue for outcomes. Because after all, talking about the circumstances versus, it's very, very, very hard in practice to do that, to figure it out. One of the reasons why there's low mobility in the US is there's lots of single parents. Single parents have lower income households. One of the reasons they're less upwardly mobile, I think. Let's say that's true. If that's true, is being a single parent a circumstance or a choice? The expression of a preference or a circumstance? If most of the gender pay gap is explained by the different choices that men and women make about which occupation they go into, and that has pay, is that a circumstance? Is that a choice? Where are those preferences formed? If it turns out that the reason Hispanics don't go to selective colleges as much as whites, controlling for test scores, is because they prefer to stay near their families, which is what one Texas study finds. The preference of staying close to home explains all of the difference in white Hispanic attendance at selective universities, according to one study. Say it's true, right? How do you deal with that? Maybe people have different time horizons on the basis of their income. So maybe people just say, look, maybe you're right that going to college will pay off in the long run. I don't care about the long run. I want a job now. They have a different discount rate, different time horizons. You just accept that. What if you grow up in a culture that seriously values hard work, like an Asian American culture? Well, if you're Roma, you shouldn't get any benefit from the fact that you grew up in a culture that says you should work hard. Any additional income you get as a result of the extra effort from the distribution of Asian Americans should be redistributed to whites and blacks. I don't think that that's really going to work. Lastly, if you have loving parents, as I did, and that gives you certain skills, is that just luck? Or even if it's luck, isn't it constitutive luck, as Susan Hurley says? That it might have been luck that I had loving parents. After all, I didn't choose my parents. But they did choose how to parent me. And the result of that is to make me who I am. And I don't think that any policymaker can seriously separate out those different elements, even of luck. So I think in the end, whether you like it or not, let's use outcome measures. Don't stop the conversation. I'm loving the conversation. But as a policymaker, and that's all I want to talk about today, outcomes will do. Here's the UK. UK set a goal in 2011 of improving social mobility, it publishes annual indicators of social mobility, and has created a new commission on social mobility and child poverty. This was the goal. Improving social mobility is a principal goal of the government's social policy. This was the coalition government. That's not very clear yet, but in the strategy, I should say, it's not entirely uncontroversial. These are some of the headlines that accompanied the publication of the social mobility strategy. One of them is about internships, where Nick Clegg, my boss, said we shouldn't be using unpaid internships in government, and David Cameron said, I've just given an unpaid internship to my friend's son. and I think that's fine, and there's a genuine disagreement, then anyway, you can see Nick Clegg's social mobility speech is condemned by inequality experts. I always put that one up because Miles is quoted in that, and he hates it when I put it up. Where basically we took issue with the Gatsby curve. Anyway, that's a longer story. I think Miles is basically right. It does say more. It's clearly intergenerational, one generation to the next. It specifically says relative, not absolute. It specifically says we're going to focus on the bottom whilst caring about everyone. And it says our currencies are going to be income and occupational status. Those are the two things. So, not bad, right? As government goals go, not bad. Then a series of leading indicators. I don't know how well you can read these. They're there mostly for illustration. At different life stages. So we break it up into life stages and then say we want to close gaps on all of these. Every single one of these measures is a gap measure. Not an overall achievement measure, a gap measure. Because that's what matters for relative social mobility. If you're interested in absolute social mobility, maybe I don't care about the gap. But if I'm interested in relative social mobility, basically the only thing I care about is the gap. So these are all gap measures, attainment, etc., etc. And you can see them all as we go through. It's also driven some data collection. Here's one. I'll just take one as an example. This is progression to higher education by age 19, based on whether you're eligible for a free school meal, i.e. poor, at 50. That's the definition. This is published every year. This is what's happening. Saw some progress up in the run-up to the recession, largely as a result of Labour government policy, and then some slight worsening. But the main measure is the gap. We could do this for all of them, but they're all online. The point is these are simply published annually. And the reason these have been chosen is because we thought at the time they would predict long-range intergenerational mobility based on the research. How good are they? Well, Paul Gregg, who is one of Joe's co-authors, and Lindsay McMillan, this is old, from 2012, decomposed the indicators to say how much of the intergenerational income correlation can be explained by those indicators. And they got to about 50%. We've added an indicator since, so you can probably say at least half. You can see that some of the indicators, according to Greg, are doing a lot more work than others. So birth weight's not doing any work, but that's because the gap in low birth weight has basically disappeared. That's a good thing. And a lot of it's being done by education. So you could narrow down and say where's the work. But overall, the indicators capture half of the internet. That's pretty good. That's good enough for me to go at as a policymaker anyway. I can then be pretty sure that if I narrow the gaps on those indicators, I'll improve the social mobility rates. There's this new institution, just published a report this week, the new State of the Nation. It's statutory, it's independent of government, and it reports annually to Parliament on how are we doing on social mobility. We created a new institution. We also, and I had to fight hard for this, put a Labour politician in charge of it in case Labour won the next election. As it turns out, the Conservatives won the next election. But the Commission survives. At this stage, I'd say its direct policy influence is less, but it is keeping the flame, that's for sure. And even this week, with their new report, they had a big splash again on unpaid internships. They are there, and they will be there for quite a while. And that's important, that institutional commitment. What are lessons in the UK? First thing, it took a long time for this issue of social mobility to get into the political bloodstream. Joe Blandon, who's in the audience, and Paul Gregg, the work they did on the decline in intergenerational mobility for the 58 and 70 cohort, backed by a think tank, the Sutton Trust, dedicated to the issue of social mobility, pushed and pushed and pushed, and then they found a moment politically. People got in. You need zealots in government. I was a zealot. I was lucky to have a boss who would go with it as well. You need people in government who are going to push this agenda. You cannot do it from outside. Institutions survive, like the Commission. Politicians don't. And if you commit to long-term goals like social mobility, that can help you justify data collection. So there was a big argument in the UK government about whether we would fund another cohort study. There's one in 58, one in 70, one in 2000. Big gap there between 70 and 2000. 2 words, Margaret Thatcher. There were many people in the government who didn't want to spend money on a survey. And one of the ways we won the argument to get the survey was, how can we have a commitment to intergenerational social mobility without the data? So we got the survey funded. These are small things. Is that right, Joe?
Yeah, it does exist now.
Not yet, but it will. If the Birth Cohort Institute are telling me the truth, but we'll see. And then I've got David Gruskin. I'm going to try and quote everybody. It's a great quote. Social genome model. Right, this is Belle Sawhill's model. She has a goal, which is you have to be middle class by middle age. Middle class is defined as 300% of the federal poverty line, and middle age, very depressingly, is defined as 40. But that's the goal, middle class by middle age. And then she has these life stages, right? How many people make it? Depends. What your race is and which income quintile you start. This is the proportion of middle class by middle age, based on their background. But She then breaks it down and says, at each life stage, I'm going to have success indicators. So to be born successfully, I'm born at a normal birth weight to a non-poor, high school educated mother who's married. You can have an argument about that. Seems to be pretty predictive. Adolescence, you graduate from high school, GPA 2.5, you haven't become a parent, and you don't have a criminal record. Those are the benchmarks. Quite empirically informed, but also contain a degree of normative judgment. How do people do? If you succeed at one stage, 55% born successfully versus 45, and so on. So success is down the left in blue. And then this is just descriptive data from the NLSY. So there's nothing clever here. She's just literally put the numbers through. And you can see that it just, as you'd expect, does predict sort of success going forward. So if you succeed at early childhood, you've got a 76% chance of going on to succeed in middle childhood. If you didn't, you've got a 41% chance. This tells us, as we'd expect, that being on track helps you stay on track. It also tells us there's plenty of people moving around, right? A lot of people drop off for a while. And so you want policies that get people on ramps as well, getting them back on. This is one approach to a series of metrics which are more immediate, right? If you're a politician, you've got to wait 40 years to find out whether your kid's being born now are middle class by middle age. In the meantime, I can see what I'm doing around the early childhood gaps or the adolescence gaps. So they perform a short-term function. And political cycles require short-term goals as well as long-term goals. So that's the social genome. I've done the UK and the social genome, and I apologise for the speed with which I'm going, but I'm very anxious that we have some time for discussion. And then I'm going to throw out some of my own proposals for how we might go forward. I have not shared many of these publicly before, and they are for discussion. Remember the quintile transition matrix. If you believe, as I do, that we should be going to improve relative intergenerational income mobility, if you believe that, then you go to something like this. If you don't believe that, great, let's have the discussion. But let's be clear that we need to make some decisions if we want this to guide policy. So if that's what it is, you might say, so I now say set as clear as possible mobility goal. So I've now just assumed we want a mobility goal, right? I've left aside that it might be something else, a well-being goal, or a growth goal, or something else, right? So I've already done a big jump, but for the purpose of time, I think I have to do that. You could say our goal is to increase mobility. Quite hard to find a government of any persuasion anywhere that wouldn't agree with that. And as I think it was George Orwell said, unless someone can reasonably disagree with what you've just said, you haven't said anything, right? So I don't think you've said anything by saying you're in favour of it. Find me a politician who's against it, then we'll have a discussion. So yeah, let's go out a bit. Upward. All right. At least we're distinguishing now between upward and downward, and you might censor out as, who was it who was censoring out downward mobility? One of the speakers earlier. It was James, wasn't it? Yeah. So at least we say upward, because I'm interested in upward. It's better. I have added income now. That's a big move. I could have done class, I could have done occupational. I've put income in. All right, okay, fine. You don't want income, you want education? Great. Let's have that discussion within the policy architecture in the commission. Let's see what we want to invest in, but I'm going for income. Still, increase upwardness is pretty vague. What if I just get people from nearly the top to go up a little bit? What if I use Bash's approach and just say I've improved upward rank directional mobility for people in the top quarter a little bit? I don't know. It's getting there. Because I also haven't ruled out absolute mobility. So I'm now going to add relative. So now I want to increase upward income relative mobility. I would say that each one of these additions has quite serious policy significance and should be treated as such. If you're serious about policy, the difference between relative and absolute is pretty big. And so might the difference between, say, income and education. Now I'm going for it. Increase upward income relative by raising the proportion born in the bottom income quintile who move up. All right, I'm going all in now. I want to move the bottom quintile. I'm saying that's my main goal. I'm less worried about the other quintiles. I just don't want intergenerational poverty. So I want an upward intergenerational move from the bottom quintile. Still, what if they only just go a bit? And I'm using quintiles, they might just go just above the line. What, they end up at the 21st or 22nd percentile? That's not very exciting. They haven't moved very far. Don't I want it to move a little bit further than that? Maybe I use rank directional. Maybe I say I want a rank directional measure. But for this, I might say I want to move them up. But still, the danger is, as a policymaker, and people like Sen have warned about this all along, and by the way, this happened in the UK government with the child poverty targets. I tell you, we just tweaked it enough to not push up child poverty. We spent only as many pounds as necessary to hold that line and stopped immediately. because we just didn't want to increase child poverty in 1 year. So you set a threshold. So actually, as a policymaker, what you'd be rationally inclined to do is take people who might get out of that quintile and just push them just out of it. You could probably do that through I don't know, relatively simple policies, but maybe they haven't moved very far. I want to move a bit further than that. So my goal is increase upward income relative mobility by raising the proportion born into the bottom income quintile and move up to one of the top 3 quintiles. I want to get up to at least the 40th percentile. I don't need them to go all the way up to the top ratio algebra style, but I want them to get to there. Okay, for discussion. Maybe you don't like it. Maybe you've got another one. I don't know if I like it yet. But at least it puts a stake in the ground. It gives you something to disagree with. It gives politicians something to think about. And if we want them to be serious about policy, we need to be serious about their goals. And we need to know what success will look like. If I had that as my measure, I could track it. It'd take a long time, but in the meantime, I've got my short-term indicators, which I think will influence that. I don't know, and that's where I need researchers and I need empirics. But at least I've got something to work with. I have a dashboard of short-term indicators, a clear long-term goal, and an institutional commitment. Oh, and then I went further. We move up to one of the top 3 to 50%. Currently it's 30-something percent. Now I've got a target. And I might then say by 2025. Right. Now, I'm not suggesting that politicians are going to go for this, and the UK government didn't go for this. But I am saying that there is a huge range between that and that. And I am urging us to try and get as close as possible to something specific enough to guide policy. This is a quote from my colleague Isabel Sawhill. I don't necessarily agree we've got enough data, although as David would say, we're probably sitting on a lot more data than we know. The problem is giving definition to it. The problem is a failure to define what is meaningful. That requires us to set our goals. And this very last thing, I've argued for the creation of an office for opportunity within the White House, in the federal government. I think my chances are even slimmer than they were. But the idea there is you have an institutional anchor that helps with this definition problem, that has people like CBO, I call it a mini CBO, that has academics working with it, that produces an annual report with leading indicators of mobility, that helps you to assess and evaluate your policies, and that can also drive the kind of data collection which David has been talking about by incentivizing people within administrations. People in governments respond to political incentives and economic incentives. And so they won't share data and do a lot of stuff we want them to do unless they know that this is being pushed from on high. And if you have a powerful office, doesn't have to be that big, within an administration, that can help drive many of these things that otherwise won't happen because that gap in the middle is too great. And with that, I'll stop and urge you to follow me on Twitter and sign up to my newsletter. I'll stop. All right. Not bad.